Thank you, Elizabeth. It's very exciting to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity. It's exciting also to be faced with such a challenging topic. What is Prader-Willi syndrome? Answered in 30 minutes. There you go. Well, one thing about Prader-Willi syndrome is that it's no longer an easy topic to summarise, because there's such an increase, such a rise in the amount of information in new research. It's exciting to have difficulty keeping up with research these days. This has not always been the case. So, our question, what is Prader-Willi syndrome? Perhaps a little too ambitious to cover in any kind of comprehensive way. And so my goal is going to be to provide a brief overview that I hope will be an introduction to our 2 days together. I hope it'll give us some kind of shared understanding, a baseline with which we can begin to approach the specialist information that is to come. And I thought perhaps the best way to go about this might be to begin with a couple of stories. Oh, excuse me. Firstly, I'd like to tell you about a woman called Jane. Well, Jane isn't her name, obviously, but we will call her Jane. Jane is in her 40s, and I went to visit her once in the course of my work with people with intellectual disabilities and challenging behaviour. Jane didn't have a diagnosis of Prader-Willi syndrome, and it was an unusual visit because I'd actually grown up with Jane and her family. I'd been to university with 2 of Jane's siblings, so it was a strange visit. Anyway, Jane and I were having a cup of tea and chatting and beginning to get to know each other, as you do, get to know each other again, when I found myself falling into a kind of abyss. Jane and I got into an argument, and it was the strangest kind of argument and oddly familiar. Jane's very mildly intellectually disabled. She's in fact very smart. She's a bright woman. She's certainly very articulate, very clear thinking, and very able to discuss issues. But I found we were having an argument about a very minor issue that really didn't matter at all. I had no idea how it started and no idea how to get out of it. Oh, look, yeah, laughing. This is the good answer. You know this. And I thought to myself, long story short, in the interest of 30 minutes, after a very long and what seemed like a very long and difficult discussion, I thought, gosh, this is like having a conversation with a person with Prader-Willi syndrome. No, like having an argument with a person with Prader-Willi syndrome. It has that air of pointlessness about it. It's an intense, adamant argument in which Jane's absolutely determined to defend her position, even though her position is obviously wrong. And nothing I say makes it better. In fact, it only makes it worse. It was then that I noticed Jane's relatively small hands and feet. And it dawned on me that Jane, in her 40s, suffered edema and leg ulcers, swelling of her legs. And although she dressed to hide it, and Jane is a woman with a wonderful, performing, vivacious personality and seems on the surface very active, but when you really looked at Jane, Jane had a real issue with both obesity and food. And when I talked to Jane's parents, they said, yes, she was a very floppy baby. And when I talked to Jane's sister, who used to share a bedroom with Jane, she said, she told me about some of the merry japes and games and pranks they got up to as children when they shared a bedroom, and she made the point that they all revolved around food. And surprise, surprise, Jane has subsequently been diagnosed late in life with Prader-Willi syndrome. Now that experience reminds me a lot of times like these times that we share together when we meet with each other. When, as Tessa put it just before. I thought you summed it up wonderfully, Tessa, when we talk about things that only we understand. And there certainly are those kinds of things. Our experiences in support of people with Prader-Willi syndrome transcend culture, transcend age, transcend learning and family circumstances. Of course, everybody who has Prader-Willi are individuals. And as we'll see today, Prader-Willi doesn't define who you are as a person, but it is always there, and there are features which people with Prader-Willi hold in common. And the reason for this is because, in answer to this first question, what is Prader-Willi syndrome? Well, at the risk of stating the obvious, Prader-Willi syndrome is a genetic condition. You know, it's been said that psychology is the meticulous scientific statement of the obvious, but here it's, I think, useful. Having Prader-Willi syndrome is something that acquiring Prader-Willi syndrome is something that happens to you not just at birth, but before birth, at conception. It's part of the genetic code that makes you you. And as such, it's part of every cell in your body, or almost every cell in your body. As such, it's multi-systemic. It affects every system in your body and your mind, directly or indirectly. Having Prader-Willi has implications for your feet, for your legs, for your muscles and bones, for your digestion, for your reproduction, for your circulation, for your breathing, certainly for your brain. It's multi-systemic and it's pervasive. That is, it will also have effect throughout your life, throughout all the different aspects and areas of your life. And it's lifelong. Perhaps now's a good time to tell you my second story. Now, this is about a man who lives not too far from Jane. I'm going to call him Kevin. Kevin, in middle life also, at about 30 years old, has made a decision. And his decision is that he no longer wants to be diabetic, and he no longer wants to be subject to his reputation for very challenging behaviour, which has caused him a lot of problems through his life. And Kevin has had the great opportunity for a new start some months ago with a new support system in a home that he's excited about. And today, Kevin has achieved remarkable things. Kevin has reversed his diabetic status, not just lost the weight. Kevin lives in a house where there are no longer locks on the fridge or locks on the food cupboards. And most remarkable of all, but, been confirmed by a number of witnesses that on a Friday night, so last night, Kevin goes to his local pub unsupervised and has 1.5 beers. And then no more. Yeah, I was sceptical too. Now, Kevin's achievements are remarkable and they're wonderful, and he should be justifiably proud of them. However, when I talk to Kevin, and particularly to Kevin's family and support people, they remind me that, if the familiar barman is not on at his favourite, or if he went to another pub, or if there was a sudden change of routine, or if Kevin suddenly became aware that no one was continuing the process of monitoring the food that's in the fridge and the cupboard. See, maybe there's no lock, but Kevin knows that there's monitoring. And maybe if he didn't have to be weighed every week, then all of them, we're obviously not going to do an experiment to find out, but all of them are clear that Kevin's diabetic status, the progress Kevin's made, would reverse pretty quickly. Does this make some sense? So, My point being, and I apologise for labouring it because, it really is pretty simple. Kevin has made wonderful progress and it should be celebrated, but he still has Prader-Willi. And he's made progress by acknowledging that he has Prader-Willi and working with the people who care for him and care about him to manage and understand the consequences of that condition for him. Yeah? Grand. So, what are they, these consequences of Prader-Willi syndrome? Well, I've grouped them together under 4 headings, and I'll go through them briefly. And as I say, I make no pretense that this is a comprehensive list, but I think it's a useful overview. I also wanted, just for anyone else who's non-geneticists among us, like myself, I wanted to begin to introduce some jargon that you'll be hearing over the next couple of days, and one of them is this term phenotype. We talk about differences in the genotype of people with Prader-Willi, that is, difference in their genetics, in the shape of their genes, and the information thereon. The phenotype is the expression of those genes in practice. And so we would talk about the developmental phenotype of Prader-Willi syndrome, the physical or the cognitive genotype, or even the genotype and phenotype, or even the distinctive behavioural phenotype that arises from the genetic differences associated with Prader-Willi. So, first, differences in early development. Hypotonia or low muscle tone in infancy, poor suck and feeding difficulties, and delayed milestones in general. Remember Jane and her story? Left undiagnosed until her 40s? Well, hopefully in New Zealand that wouldn't happen today, because when a baby is born who is at risk of Prader-Willi syndrome, almost invariably that baby will be hypertonic. It will have low muscle tone. It'll be a floppy baby. And when that occurs, that triggers a test. As part of that low muscle tone, feeding difficulties are common, and this is the irony that's often reported about Prader-Willi syndrome. In the mind of many, difficulty with overeating has become the defining characteristic of Prader-Willi syndrome, but these are people who begin life causing their parents a great deal of worry because it's hard to get them to eat. And milestones in general, language and motor milestones are generally delayed. As people grow and as childhood progresses, typically difficulties with feeding attenuate, they get better. At the same time, the hypotonia, that's the low muscle tone, tends to continue, although it may improve. And as a result, we see a number of difficulties facing young people with Prader-Willi syndrome that perhaps are not common for other children. They may be more at risk of some kinds of injuries, for example. We typically see people of small stature, have relatively small hands and feet, and a distinctive pear shape to their body. So low muscle tone tends to mean narrow shoulders, more weight carried here. We often see incomplete or delayed puberty and hypogonadism. It's reduced or absent development of the gonads. We see an increased threshold for vomiting. People with Prader-Willi syndrome tend not to vomit. An increased tolerance for pain and difficulties perceiving temperature. So, in Christchurch in New Zealand, when a man turns up to work on a nor'west day that's, pretty damn hot for New Zealand, approaching 27 degrees, but he's dressed as if it was the coldest day of winter, and he plans to go and work outside in the market garden, this is an indication of an altered perception of temperature. And he needs support. He needs someone to remind him, you're likely to do yourself some harm if you don't take off some of those clothes. We also see reduced or rather viscous saliva, sticky saliva, which can lead to some of the increased risk of certain health problems, in particular increased dental problems. Jane, being a case in point, at her age, in her youth, she had been prescribed, particularly for her reputation for challenging behaviour, a number of medications in syrup form, not knowing that she didn't have the salivary production to get rid of the syrup, of the sugar. And people with Prader-Willi tend also to have some difficulties with the enamel in their teeth. Jane suffered horrendous dental abscesses and often didn't acknowledge them because of her high pain threshold. Yeah. Now, many of these distinctive physical features are seen much less often than they used to be because of the innovation of human growth hormone, which can reduce hypertonia, increase muscle tone, increase height, do all sorts of good things. We also see a distinctive cognitive profile. Now, by cognitive, we refer to mental processes, thinking, remembering, those kinds of things, problem solving. Firstly, we do see Prader-Willi syndrome is associated with intellectual impairment. Now, generally, the threshold for intellectual disability, a diagnosis of intellectual disability, is considered to be around a score of IQ about 70, 75 on a standard IQ test. Traditionally, this is... many people with Prader-Willi syndrome score somewhat higher than that, and so are not regarded technically as having an intellectual disability, but as being in what we call the borderline range. However, really, for various reasons that haven't got time to go into now, especially for people with Prader-Willi, that simple number, that IQ, is really not a very useful number, because people with Prader-Willi also show a unique pattern of strengths and weaknesses within that IQ test. And this, I think, is something we see a lot in people with Prader-Willi. We see them being very smart sometimes, very able, and very disabled at other times or in other circumstances. So, for example, people who have Prader-Willi syndrome tend to have relative strengths in areas of visual processing, classically in terms of visual memory. So basically, they're very good at seeing and understanding and processing the things that they see, and then particularly remembering them, especially if they're linked with emotion. So, for example, if at your house somebody comes to visit you who hasn't, has forgotten the lecture that you will no doubt have given them, and brings half a chocolate bar in their bag, and they plonk their bag down beside their chair, and your child who has Prader-Willi syndrome sees the chocolate bar. It's a visual memory. Now, a number of things will happen. One is that will certainly cause a degree of anxiety or of heightened emotion, maybe excitement, but emotionality, heightened excitement. Fair enough? Person with Prader-Willi, often generally very motivated also to fit in and not to appear, may not show that emotion on their face, but it'll be there. The thing is, even if your child with Prader-Willi syndrome doesn't get to eat that chocolate bar, and your friend picks up her bag and goes away, the next time your friend arrives, especially if she brings that bag that once had a chocolate bar in it, that visual memory will prompt a rise in anxiety and excitement, emotionality, and a desire to have a good ferret through that bag because there was a chocolate bar there once. Fair enough? Now, this could happen to any of us, with an emotional producing stimulus like half a chocolate bar, which is pretty exciting, I've got to say. But for a person with Prader-Willi, that memory is laid down more quickly, laid down more strongly, and it'll last longer. Yeah? So, a strength in terms of visual processing. And there are other strengths as well. Weaknesses, though, tend to arise in particular around what are sometimes called higher cognitive functions. By that I mean things like the ability to change your mind under pressure, the ability to control your impulses. We call it executive functioning. The ability to plan ahead and to sequence that plan and to follow it through. And especially what we might call metacognitive function, thinking about thinking or thinking about ourselves. Self-reflection tends not to be a strength for people with Prader-Willi. And so, for example, when I ask the first man I ever met in New Zealand, some 20 years ago, I asked him, gosh, how did you enjoy that Prader-Willi camp at Turangi in the middle of the North Island? And you saw all your friends there, did you have a good time? And he said, I won't tell you what he said because it was quite rude, but it was basically to the effect that these were people who all had some very serious issues with their weight. Now, the irony of that statement was that he was by far the heaviest person there. By far. But that irony, which was so obvious to us, completely lost on him because he's really not very good at thinking about himself. Now, two issues just at the bottom there, 2 points that might be considered a little controversial. Spoken language is sometimes impaired or absent, but it may also be a relative strength. Many people who have Prader-Willi syndrome are really good conversationalists, and in fact, really good company. They're knowledgeable, they're interested, they're fun. Often, however, those two issues together, the relative strength of language and the relative weakness of higher cognitive function, can get people into trouble. And we'll see that shortly. We'll go through this pretty quickly because time is against us. We also see in the consequences of having Prader-Willi syndrome distinctive behavioural challenges. And it's interesting, consistently in international studies, there have only been a few of them, international studies of caregivers of people with Prader-Willi, confirmed in a little pilot study I did among caregivers in the North Island of New Zealand. When you ask them what their greatest challenge is in their work, no one says managing the food. No one. They mention that later on in the conversation, but they say things like, well, food is a given. Sure, it's a challenge, but once you've got it under control, then you've got it under control. Food is the easiest challenge, was my favourite term. Instead, each caregiver, without exception, who I interviewed, mentioned some aspect of their client's behaviour as the thing that gave them greatest challenge. And it was interesting because it was different kinds of behaviours. Some of them were food-related, behaviours that might loosely be termed behaviours of dishonesty, if you like. Another jargon term, confabulation. Have you heard that term before? Yeah, good on you. Essentially telling stories. Many people with Prader-Willi are wonderful storytellers who are just not, even if there's not food at stake, just not inclined to let the truth get in the way of a good story. Many people with PW, when faced with the opportunity for getting food, really won't balk at stealing or at playing one family member or one neighbour off against another. There are many stories extant of a young person with Prader-Willi going to the neighbours and saying, my parents have gone to blah for a holiday, they've left me here, I've got no food, goodness me, poor me. Foraging, food seeking, hoarding, tantrums and meltdowns, often really very intense. And distinctive among tantrums and meltdowns, intense challenging behaviour that occurs among people with developmental disabilities, among people with Prader-Willi syndrome, often they're intense. They're more difficult to, they affect you more emotionally, and they're more difficult to resolve. Other behaviours of excess, so excessive smoking, excessive gambling, excessive engagement in hobbies. Jane had an unusual problem, which was an excessive interest in country music, and she was evicted from a number of chat rooms. And it's interesting because even before her Prader-Willi was identified, the behaviour for which she was referred to me, the behaviour that was seen as challenging, was excessively seeking support. Jane had been assessed, and accurately assessed, as being very capable. She could cook and clean and look after herself, and so she was put in a flat by herself with a little support each week. Jane was lonely and anxious and had terrible problems with higher cognitive functioning, like organising herself and sequencing events. And every day, every single day, many times a day, Jane would nip to the group home next door, knock on the door and say, "Oh, look, can you help me do up my shoes?" Or, you know. Now, part of that was Jane seeking the support she needed, but part of it was also, Jane's not a woman who really knows when enough is enough in any area of her life. And in particular, I think probably the last point is the one that is most common and perhaps causes the most difficulty in practice once issues around food have been addressed. Many people with Prader-Willi face difficulties with change. They have a reputation for stubbornness and inflexibility, and difficulties with task switching, changing from one thing or another, and difficulties with changes in routine. I am just aware that the time is against us. So perhaps we'll go through this very quickly, and then I'll close, yeah. Prader-Willi syndrome is also a condition. That's divided into a number of subtypes. And these are defined by different types of genetic differences. Really, there are two that make up the great bulk of cases of people with Prader-Willi. About 3/4 or 2/3 of people who have Prader-Willi syndrome have what's referred to as a paternal deletion subtype. Now, exactly what paternal deletion is, we will hear later on in these 2 days from people with much bigger brains than I. But these are people who are generally seen as having more distinctive Prader-Willi-like physical features, having lower muscle tone, and having more difficulty with motivation, having lower activity levels. Perhaps also having higher levels of challenging behaviour. About 25%, according to most measures, most studies, have the other common form, which is uniparental disomy. These are people who may look less like a person with Prader-Willi syndrome, may or may not, but they tend to be people who, in particular, have good verbal IQ scores. They tend to be people with very good language. And although they have a reputation for perhaps not being not having the same level of challenging behaviour, that good language often gets them into more difficulty. Often these are people who are disabled by their good language ability because it leads to their support needs being underestimated. So, and finally, there is a small group of people who have a condition we call an imprinting defect, usually between 1% and 5%. These are people who have many more features of autism and often appear much more like people with autism than somebody with Prader-Willi. I have to say, certainly in the people I have met, and we're talking a very small number, still a very strong interest in food. So, what is Prader-Willi syndrome? Well, it's a condition of genetic origin. It's also a condition characterised by high individual variance in its expression. So one person with Prader-Willi syndrome, even one person with Prader-Willi syndrome who struggles to the same extent with food, often those difficulties with food will be expressed in different ways. One person may approach the neighbours, whereas another would never. Prader-Willi syndrome is a condition that people have. It's a set of challenges that people face. It's not who people are. It's not a condition that needs to define you. It is a condition that needs to be understood. And perhaps the best way I can illustrate that, just in closing, is to tell you briefly about a more recent interaction I had with Jane. Now, Jane had suffered, after I had finished working with her and I hadn't seen her for a number of months, she suffered a number of bereavements, as we often do in middle life. And I called her up on the phone and said, Jane, I'm really sorry for your trouble. And she said, thank you, I appreciate that. I said, Jane, look, I was thinking I could call in and see you, say good day, and we might have a cup of tea. I've got some time on Wednesday when I'm in town, about 1 o'clock. No, she said, don't come round, don't want to see you. Oh, I said, honestly, I didn't want to hurt, you're not in any trouble, no, don't want to see you. No, thank you for calling, goodbye. As I was, Jane failed to hang up the phone properly. And after her goodbye, I heard a support person calling out in the background, who's that on the phone, Jane? Then I heard Jane say, it was John Ford. Silly bugger wanted to come round at lunchtime. Do you see what I mean? Prader-Willi syndrome doesn't define who Jane is, but it is always there. Thank you.